So let's welcome back to Mark Fitzpatrick on this podcast. I found this really quite fascinating, and I hope you will too. So without further ado. Well, Mark, you must be holding the record of being here more than anyone else. So welcome back.
I know. Thank you very much. I know we just can't quit each other, can we?
No, this is it.
I think that the best conversations are the ones that you feel like there isn't really an end to them. You've
Exactly.
never exhausted them. They just keep going.
Exactly. I totally agree. So Mark Fitzpatrick, welcome back again. Because we've got, I know a little bit about what you do, but not enough not to ask questions. So this is quite a good sort of position to be in, really. So I wanted to sort of today, because we've spoken a lot about all the sort of artistic stuff that you do, your writing, but there's this the sort of the magical component of your thinking and how you arrived at that. And for the people, because I've got quite a mix of people who listen to this. So I like to also use, the psychological thing as an interchangeable with magical thinking as well. So
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, if anybody knows anything about the psychology or psychological movement, psychoanalysis and all that sort of stuff, it obviously comes from a very sort of weird place anyway.
Oh yeah.
So let's take this back. You mentioned it, I think, in the very, very first interview we did, very first chat, about being interested in sort of weird stuff, the paranormal, magical stuff. You read a lot of science fiction and quite a few early on, and then I think in your words, you sort of said, when I grew up, I put away childish things.
Exactly.
Paraphrasing St. Paul, isn't it?
St. Paul, yeah. I can never remember which letter it is. I think it's Corinthians something or other, but I find those words very resonant, and they sort of they return in my thinking a lot, like the sort of put away childish things, in a glass darkly, now face to face. But what's interesting now is that my position on them has basically reversed. Like, as in, now I feel like I was a child, and I thought as a child is a desirable thing, and it's a thing that we must get back to. And I thought that it's one thing to only be able to deal with and believe in the things we can see face to face, but actually looking in the glass darkly has its own place and its own use. And yeah, I mean, that's like a black mirror, right? That's the exact description of a scrying mirror. I think that as a child of my age, well, I don't mean I am now a child of 43. I mean, as a child of the late 20th century, I was brought up in an incredibly secular, incredibly rationalist Western world, where those of us who had the privilege of education, access to media, stuff like that, we were brought up in a world where, superstition was childish, and societies that believed in the intangible and the other world were sort of primitive and childlike, and where there was this sort of teleological narrative that the whole development of human thought and history had led to its pinnacle, which was us, the rationalist atheists, and that now history was basically over. We'd won, democracy, capitalism, rationalism, empiricism, and that was it. That the rest, it was all over bar the shouting, basically. And I think that as a young adult coming into the 21st century, basically the towers fell in every way. In the actual real world, the Twin Towers collapsed, and that was such a sort of moment of symbolic violence against everything we believed. And it just, things fall apart, the center cannot hold, and the whole thing came crashing down. And we've been shot into this 21st century where a lot of magical thinking and alternative spiritualities and, just like full-on witchcraft has come back into the public eye and the public consciousness in a way that we couldn't have imagined in the 80s and 90s, which were very kind of rational. And I think in the 90s, there was definitely that thing. There was that sort of X-Files thing, like sort of isolated nerds wanting to believe the truth was out there. And it was all very conspiracy theorist. And we talked about that in the previous episode, the conspiracy stuff. But what I did was sort of as a teenager, I tried to embrace the kind of the rational and the sort of the daylight world. But I couldn't get away from a sort of core of mystical experience. And, I changed my language for it. Like I sort of, I started talking rather about feeling things like energy and peak experiences, like that sort of senses of oceanic well-being and knowledge that I believed were purely psychological, if not chemical. And I also had that sort of positivist belief that one day science would be able to measure these things and that there was nothing supernatural about them, that they were just things we didn't understand yet. And I mean, that may or may not be true, but now I realize that in fact it's just a different paradigm.
Yes.
Like science is a different paradigm. It doesn't mean it's true or false.
Yeah.
It's a different way of looking at the world.
Yes, I think that's really interesting, because I think there were, I'm just trying to sort of pitch this when I first sort of heard this. Some scientists, maybe about 40 years ago, started to talk about the fact that some things were unknowable.
Yeah.
Openly saying that some things were unknowable. But in actual fact, I think really what's sort of happening, and as time has gone on, which is really what you're sort of alluding to, is that there is so much that's unknowable, because it's like you could use the scientific measure for the things that science can measure.
Exactly.
But there is very little actually that we can really truly measure, because you get the surface matter, right? So I always like to think about, drawing it back to the sort of thing about the sort of creative and the unconscious and what have you. So again, we could we could use unconscious and then go like, spiritual thinking or whatever, whatever it is that we can't logically work out, or mythic thinking would be better to say.
Yes, I like that better. Yeah.
So you could measure this little bit here. So it's a bit like the billiard ball scenario, where you could measure that first shot, and you could track the trajectory of the first ball, and then maybe what happens on impact to the others, and then what happens? It becomes like it's just too complex.
Yeah, it's chaos, isn't it?
It is chaos.
Chaos is introduced, and it's that kind of Brownian motion of molecules, or it's the sort of the chaos theory thing of, if you have a mathematical model, it is impossible to build a model that is complex enough to reflect the real world, and therefore in the real world there is chaos, there is unknowables, there is tiny deviations from your model that will end up with the end result being totally different. And we have wonderful sort of images for this, like a butterfly flaps its wings in the Amazon, and there's a hurricane in New York, and those have entered popular culture, and they're quite funny because they're so striking. Or you go back in time and you step on a butterfly, and then the whole history of the world is changed. But actually, there's a fundamental truth to those things. But the thing is, it's not just one butterfly. It's like there are constantly butterflies flapping and being stepped on everywhere.
So there's a couple of things that you've raised. I'll say them now before I forget them.
Do.
Within literature and within creative thinking, there have been a lot of stories about the future. And they are mostly totally inaccurate, right? So if you, you know, people's ideas of what, you know, what the Victorians might have thought would have been happening in the year, whatever. And of course, what tends to happen in those sort of projections of what we think this can be is always predicated on what we understand as our technology at the time. Yeah. So you'd have these amazing air balloons that could do all sorts of stuff, and incredible bicycles that could ride on air. But they, you know, we always miss those things that suddenly arrive out of nowhere, seemingly. They're often sometimes based. So this is a little thread that maybe they are correcting. They're based on something that already exists, but not in the way that we know it, sort of in a Spockian type thing. So, for instance, the iPhone is a phone, but it's a lot more. So, so even though we're still basing it on something we already know, it sort of becomes something different in essence. And that is one of the interesting things about us not really understanding where, you know, logically understanding where things go, which then brings me to the second point I was going to say, because that, I think, sums up a lot of stuff about predictions, you know, divinations, which is where I think, so let's go down the divination rabbit hole.
All right.
So when you see, you know, the classic sort of like Nostradamus thing, or, you know, that type of big visionary sort of predictive stuff, they're often in language, and it's true with obviously the Greeks and all the rest of it, often in a language which is difficult to nail down, right? It's not like, by so-and-so, this will happen. It's some sort of story that you sort of have to, it's a riddle. And from a logical point of view, it's like looking at that and going, yeah, well, you know, that can mean anything.
Yeah.
But in actual fact, that's more like how, well, it seems to me anyway, how dreams work. There are things that are bubbling up from the surface, like you used that analogy earlier about, you know, saying about how we thought we'd got all this going, you know, we'd sorted out, it's only a matter of time before we had the answer. But it seems like underneath there was a lot of stuff percolating.
Absolutely.
And then you get the thing where you said the Twin Towers comes down, and it's almost like, oh my goodness, if that's not a mythic story, you know, it's the Tower of, however you want to call it, Babel or Babel or whatever, coming down. And then that does this, and it separates people, and it does, you know, and so on. And you sort of look at that and you go, that is strange.
Yeah, I mean, it was an event that had this sort of mythic resonance across paradigms. Like it was the Tower of Babel, but I mean, the Two Towers is also, you know, Tolkien.
Yeah.
Right. And then it's also the tarot card in the tarot.
Exactly.
And, you know, like the tower falling, and also the tarot card in the tarot is not just a tower. It's the tower struck by lightning from the sky by the ire of God.
With people falling out of it.
Exactly. And the name for the tarot, for that card in French, is La Maison Dieu, the house of God.
Yes.
Which is also, when you think about it, those were, the Twin Towers were the symbol and the temple of the sort of late 20th century capitalist Western democracy, which were struck by what the people on those planes, like the hijackers, what they thought in their paradigm, this was the wrath of God. They were the wrath of God. And, you know, when the wrath of one God meets the temple of another God, you have an earth-shaking event. And I think that the ripples of that event sort of spread out throughout the collective unconscious and the imaginal and our cultures and our politics. And it basically said that the twin certainties upon which we had based our entire narrative of the end of history, like the Francis Fukuyama book, were capitalism and democracy, and that basically both of them then collapsed. You know, capitalism collapsed, democracy collapsed, and not just collapsed, but were revealed to be sort of, they were a bit like the Wizard of Oz, you know, they were the little guy pulling the levers behind the curtain.
Yes.
And in fact, they weren't these kind of end states for society. They were just a transitional phase like everything else has ever been.
Exactly.
But the transition to what, we don't really know yet.
Exactly.
You know?
In actual fact, it'd be a transition to another state of transition. You know,
well, exactly.
That
exactly.
is the nature of
and
how
that,
things are.
you know, and I think that, you know, this is the crisis of our age and of the crisis of our generation, is the fact that in the 90s, I remember this so vividly, but people who had that kind of spark of political activism in the West, they used to really struggle to find stuff to protest about. Like, I know that there was, but under the surface, like you say, there was all these really big things going on. Like there was the anti-globalization thing and there was the environment thing that have now surged out in a way that is like they're out in the open now. But back then, they were kind of suppressed by the general narrative that, you know, everything's fine and we're going to entertain ourselves to death forever. It's just going to be a sort of a society of complete automation and abundance. Everyone's going to become Western democracies just the way we wanted. Communism has fallen. It's all over. You know, the fat lady is warming up her throat and she's about to let loose. But actually, it turns out that she was the herald of the apocalypse.
She often is, and actually, isn't she?
Yeah, well, exactly.
So we've got another synchronicity, haven't we?
Yeah, but I think that just to finish that thought, the you know, people mock those who say that we are living through the apocalypse, and I say no, we're living through an apocalypse, and in the true sense of the word, which is revelation, we're living in a time when that which is hidden is becoming revealed, and that which was under the surface is coming right out and becoming blatant and becoming almost caricatured. Like the world seems to be drawn in broader strokes than it was before. Our politicians, our public figures are like puppets or caricatures of, I mean, you know, many of them were predicted when people tried to imagine what was the most ridiculous thing we could possibly imagine. Oh, well, I'll tell you what, Donald Trump as president.
Yes.
Or whatever.
Simpsons. Yeah, I know. The Simpsons got nailed. Yeah, exactly.
And you know, futuristic satire, unfortunately, is often closer to the truth than the actual science fiction that's being serious. You know?
That's what I was getting at. That is exactly what I was getting at.
So precisely.
So the point about satire is that, again, and if you look at the structure of myth, you've got the story, which sort of is the narrative thread that takes the thing along. But for that story to operate, you have to accept certain aspects unconsciously to allow that story to happen. And it seems to me that those are the things that are the truths, the things that you have to accept for that story to exist. So they're not actually anything intellectual. There is, they are the sort of, so as an example of this, so if we go back to Genesis story. I'm just plucking something out of the air here. But this idea of, there you are, you're in the garden, everything's just as it should be. And then you're told, first of all, don't eat that fruit, which is like, that's asking for trouble for a start, isn't it? So that means to say you're already told by something that knows everything, that as soon as he tells you not to do that, he knows that you're going to do that.
Of course he does.
Exactly. So you go and do that, and as soon as you got the knowledge, that's the problem. Well, it's not a problem, it's the thing that acts as a catalyst that everything then changes. Because then you can't go back anymore to that thing. And of course, that narrative, that story, it resonates on so many different levels that you can sort of go, it's the same thing happening over and over again. That is,
absolutely.
As soon as you use knowledge to do something, there is an automatic downside that you cannot avoid. It is just the way it is.
It's loss of innocence, isn't it?
It is.
Because when we don't know something, there is a bliss to not knowing, and there is an innocence and a naivety which is actually quite beautiful. And as soon as we know something, well, yes, we can use it, but now we have to carry the weight of that knowledge forever.
There is something else as well. While you say that, it's that naivety is also, how can I use this? I was going to say a skill, because weirdly, what tends to happen when you do, and I can draw this back into the thing about using cut up, where you use random info, things thrown together. The fact that it's not following a vertical sort of journey like the internet does. I've done this, and now I do that, and then I do that. Once you have this sort of lateral thing happen, it sort of opens doors to things that you can't know, and it sort of floods in. So
it does, and I think that's exactly what the when I was a child, I thought as a child thing, because what a child does is play.
Yes.
And play is not it's not like a lateral step-by-step thing. No. It moves tangentially, and it moves sort of sideways and back and forth and in and out, and it's organic rather than a structure that you build. Like, let's say it spreads. Play is like a kind of mycelium network rather than a tree or a tower. It's not a tower that you construct. It's something that it lets out spores, and they ramify. It's ramifying.
Yes.
And as you say, like, the skill is in being able to see that way again and being able to go back to that state. Because I think that, if you wanted to, and I mean, I know people have, and I know it just makes loads of sense. You take your Garden of Eden story and you just say, that is just a parable of child development, like, that is just, of course, you're naked and innocent when you're a child. And of course, the voice of authority says, don't touch that, don't look at that. It's not for kids your age. And then, of course, you do it, and then you fall and you lose innocence. And then, what is the curse of God when you were cast out of Eden? Well, for it's very gendered, obviously, but for women it's that they shall bring forth children in pain and labor, and for men it's that they will labor in the fields. And I think we could look at that just as like, well, that's just adolescence, isn't it? Like, women have that sort of the onset of menstruation, which shows their ability to bear children, and men, but actually in our society, men and women also have to go and earn a living. They have to go and work, and they have to go, and then they forget how to play, and then they forget what the actual sort of the knowledge that they acquired really was, because I guess they're so busy laboring by the sweat of their brow, outside Eden, that they forget the way back in. But the fact is, and I think this is just to bring it back really, that in a very large sense, this is what magic is, and this is what art is. It's the keys back into Eden.
Yes, because
You know?
it's funny you're saying this, because my next question was going to be, what is your sort of definitional working of tarot reading or magic, to tie it back?
Okay,
And
well,
you sort of
yeah.
done this already, but just
Right. I think that
pose those questions. Pose that question to you.
To start with magic, and I think that it's an endlessly debatable thing. What is magic? And I think that if we go back to what we were saying about paradigms, then magic is a paradigm that doesn't have to negate the scientific paradigm, but exists alongside it, in which causality and in which the senses, the physical senses, are no longer our primary work, where logic and the logos is not our primary work anymore, where we're working more with chaos, and we're working more with gnosis, and we're working more with the logic of dream. We're working more with the in the symbolic register, whereas science works in the register of proof and the register of empirical evidence. Magic works, on the logic of, if we wanted to borrow a definition which is still quite good, actually, is what James Fraser talked about when he talked about, contagion and correspondence, which is, things operate on each other by their contiguity or by their symbolic resemblance. And so therefore, that's why we think that the fixed stars, like the wandering stars, the planets, why they can have an influence on our lives is because we have ascribed symbolic value to them. And why, for example, if I take a sample of somebody's hair and a photograph of them, and do things symbolically to those artifacts, why I can think that by the law of contagion, they can have an effect on the person from which they come or which they represent. And then my own spin on that is that magic is like a physical and spiritual paradigm that works more on the principles of poetry than science, in the sense that everything is metaphor, everything is metonymy. And what are those? Those are sympathy and contagion. And that, alchemy is poetry, because each one is about transformation and correspondence. And so I've tried to rationalize my beliefs. I know that's a very long-winded answer.
No, it's good. It's very good. It's very good. Yeah.
But what I am trying to get past is this thing where someone says, "What's magic?" and you go into a whole dissertation. And what I want to say now is, magic is the poetry of the spirit.
That's eloquently put. Because you're saying about, obviously, there's a thing called what's it called, a signature of.
Yeah, the doctrine of signatures.
Yes, yeah. So this is used in herbalism.
Exactly.
And it's been used obviously by every ancient or traditional community, as far as we can work out, from the beginning of time, where something that looks like the thing you want to fix or heal is the thing that you use to fix and heal the thing, right?
Precisely.
And there was obviously this understanding that everything is interlocked, which we've forgotten to our detriment. And we're only realizing now that suddenly science is now discovering this stuff, which we actually do right back at the beginning.
That's it. It's coming full circle. It's coming full circle, because actually the scientific paradigm, when you get when you get to the furthest reaches of where science is today,
yes,
you get to advances in things like in physics, in consciousness studies, in philosophy, or neurological studies, or whatever, where they're actually not quite proving, but they're coming to terms with the idea that actually all that stuff that they used to write off as superstition is actually way more true than it has any right to be, according to the original sort of 19th century scientism.
yes,
And I mean, I'm sure that your listeners probably know the examples and stuff like that, but just things like, for example, that astral projection apparently seems to be verifiable and replicable in the lab. Things like that time appears not to be linear at all, but rather to be a sort of an arbitrary measure of entropic decay that we use to keep ourselves tethered to a sequence of events. But in fact, things in the future can affect things in the past, and things in the past can be relived, and that time is way more malleable than we thought it was. And also that things like the observer effect, things like whereby the very act of perceiving a thing changes the nature of the thing.
yes,
Or the fact that there is no real proof that the way that we experience reality is in fact the only reality, or is even a reality, that it might be kind of like a virtual dream that we're in. And these have been philosophical questions forever, but now the scientists are like, oh shit, they're actually right.
Yes. So entanglement.
Exactly.
So that's contagion, if you like, in another form, because obviously once.
Totally.
Okay. And the whole idea of contagion goes right, but everybody understood the idea of contagion. It's not a modern scientific idea at all.
It's like it's almost like a visceral thing. We understand that on a gut level, right? That two things which have once been joined, if you take them apart, no matter how far away from each other they are still linked. Spooky action at a distance, right?
Yes. So I did a podcast, a solo podcast, a little while back called Ripples in a Pool, which was
I heard that.
Yeah,
good stuff.
Which was actually one of the sort of essays for this book that I'm finishing off at the moment. But it's also the fact that if you look at something that causes an event, will then set off a whole series of ripples. And of course, the ripples won't look like the thing that caused the ripple, but they are, by their nature, something resonant about that thing that caused the ripple. And that seems to be one of the things that in the process of doing certain, whether you want to look at it scientific, as from the psychological point of view, or the, it's the same thing. A lot of processes that you look at, which you could say are magical, even if it's from the point of view of the American self-help books, think positive and all that type of thing. And then,
but that's a magical tradition too.
Of course,
thought,
absolutely, it
absolutely is. Yeah.
So a lot of this stuff, like when you were saying about when you were growing up, a lot of this stuff was out there, but it had that veneer of the scientists say this type of thing.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And
again, it was almost like a good card trick, this sleight of hand. And NLP is totally that.
And that was very much a late 20th century
it was
thing, and all of it at the time was required to have the kind of scientific veneer in order to be accepted. And the thing is, I think that now you've got some people who are magicians and sorcerers, and they're like, oh, that stupid psychological model, you're still stuck in that, are you? And it's like, no, mate, it's a paradigm. Like, if you want to apply it, it is absolutely coherent. It is absolutely coherent to think. And if you want to think this is perfectly good as a working model, that all of it is effects on the psyche, and all of it is the psychological self. I don't mean the neurological self, because we still don't bloody understand that. But, you know, if you look at sort of the functioning of the magical worldview and magical effects as purely psychological, it totally works. Except for the odd time when it doesn't, and then you're screwed. But then, you know, so you need to be able to shift paradigms. You need to be able to say, okay, well, let me think about this from an animist perspective, from a spirit model, or what's become trendy kind of in the 2000s was thinking about things on an information theory model, you know, that everything is information that interacts with each other. And, you know, and I think that we're on the cusp of kind of developing a new model, which is sort of like the mashup version, which is where we have the ability to shift paradigms, which of course chaos magicians have been doing very ably since the 70s, but they were kind of more doing it for a lark.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't necessarily because it was useful. They were kind of
doing it. It was a case of testing something out, wasn't it, really?
Exactly. Well, but it was also just to challenge yourself. It's like, can you, you know, I can believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. How many can you do? But whereas in fact, the ability to be a bit sort of agile and to shift one's paradigms and to sort of to be able to syncretize the paradigms and say, look, just because I'm a bloody wizard doesn't mean I don't want traditional, I don't want, sorry, you know, scientific medicine to treat me if I get cancer, you know, because scientific medicine is bloody amazing. It's fantastic, you know.
Depending on what level you want to be on, doesn't it? I mean, that's the other thing.
Right, you know.
You see,
but it can't do everything. It can't do everything either, you know.
No, well, the thing. So let's go back to your sort of experiences of things that you've done that you sort of go, that's weird.
Yeah.
Tell me. Tell me of a few things that, you know, in whatever order you want to speak of them.
Okay. I mean, I'm always a fan of chronological.
Okay, let's do that then.
You know, because I like the growing story. I like narrative.
Yes.
And so
narrative is time exists. Let's do that then.
Exactly. But the thing is, time exists in the sense that time is a narrative we impose. And so when we tell a story, we tend to tell it from the beginning to the end as we understand those things, because that's the way that we experience things. We experience things with one thing after another. And when that chronology gets disrupted, like if we have a premonitory dream, or if we relive an experience from our past, then we get freaked out because that's not the linear thing we're used to. But stories, like basic stories, are usually linear, you know, and it makes sense. That's just, we digest them better that way, you know. And so my story as a teenager was that I basically figured out how to be an atheist existentialist, and that was pretty cool. And I liked that. And, you know, I was very sort of confident in the ability of science to solve it. But at the same time, I had a great tropism towards mysticism. But at the time, I dressed up my mysticism in words like peak experience, which I think is from Maslow. Abraham Maslow, I think, came up with that. And it's that feeling that we all know when you feel like you're on the cusp of revelation and you feel a certain sense of oneness with the natural world and a kind of a dissolving of the boundaries between your body and the universe. You know, that oceanic feeling of oneness that you can get when you're on a mushroom trip or whatever. But I think that, you know, it feels great when you feel like you've earned it, like you've done it yourself, like you've got yourself into a place and into circumstances and into a set of stimuli that shoot you into that sort of wow, like I just, you know, experienced cosmic consciousness. That was awesome, you know. And so as a teenager, I was already sort of on that trip. And then gradually.
Okay, so did you have a couple of experiences that you can sort of go, yeah, that one was like? that really made me start to think,
Yeah, I mean, there was a couple of things.
okay, go on.
One of
All
them
means.
really, one of them links back to the theme of the podcast very much, because it was about writing, and it was about the first time that I wrote something that I felt tapped into something deeper than I was myself. Like, it was, I mean, I'm not going to say it was channeling, but it was certainly tapping the well. It was drawing up material from my deep subconscious, but also I felt from a more collective unconscious, from a kind of a world spirit. And it was literally like a homework assignment. You know, we had to write a creative piece that we're going to put a book together of these pieces when I was in school in America at one point. And I couldn't do it. And then on the day before it was due, I sat down at my computer, or my dad's computer actually, big clunky beast that it was. And I sat down and just started writing, and this thing sort of poured out of me, and it tapped into dreams that I had had, and it was very, like, it didn't make much sense, but it was a dream logic, and I still have it. I found it again, that piece. But I basically got into that sort of flow state of writing where I was highly emotional. I was actually crying as I was writing, not because it was sad, but because I was like trembling with this strong emotion of sort of channeling that spirit, or that I was tapping into mythic experience, for the first time consciously, and it was very conscious because I was writing it down. And I came out of that like shaken, and also with the firm conviction that no matter what else in the world, I had to be a writer, and that was the only thing I could do. And I think a lot of my life has been a series of moments where I have tried to argue myself out of it. Sorry. I tried to argue myself out of being a writer and say that that's not practical and you're never going to make a living. And I still have never made a living doing it. And I've actually hampered myself significantly by being too practical and, always trying to find a safer job than writer. But that, and it was all of a piece, you see, because that experience, it was to do with these kind of dreams and nightmares and sort of symbols that were in my unconscious that I was dredging up, and yet they were actually intensely magical, and they still remain as touchstones for me, to the point where the ending scene, it's basically like a man wakes up in the woods with no memory of who he is or how he got there, and he is being pursued by something horrible, and which is just a typical nightmare. But in the end of it, he finds his way to a ruined cottage that he seems to remember but can't quite be sure, and he knows that there is something hidden there, and he takes out a loose brick and he reaches into, and these are the words from the original story, he reaches into the hollow behind the hearthstone and pulls out a bag, a crackling leather bag, which has a sort of a crystal orb in it, which he takes out and shatters, and then the whole reality shatters. And, that is the touchstone, like that sort of orb in the bag, in the hollow behind the hearthstone, is a touchstone for my, not just belief, but like the core being of the magical experience. And then that phrase, it was actually my teacher who pulled it out, because I didn't have a title. And he said, yeah, you do. Look, that's the title, The Hollow Behind the Hearthstone. And I was like, oh yeah, shit, you're right. That's cool. That's a good title. And then that's become the title for my website. And it's become a whole sort of mythos of symbology for me. And it is, in a sense, where I situate magic, which is, it's not the hearth, but it's like hidden behind the hearth but it's still at the center of the home, right? It's still the place where the hearth and home and the home fires are, but it is in this hollow place behind that where you hide secret things and special things and magical things. And the idea of the hollow being that the opposite of a you know, it's like a cave, it's like a pocket, or a you know, it's the sort of the cup or the cauldron, or it's all those hollow things, and this is the thing that comes from there, from that place, which I think is, you know, it can also be seen as a metaphor for the unconscious. But the idea is that it's uncanny because it's in the home, but it's hidden. It's behind the hearth, it's behind the flames, it's behind the fire, but it's in that place where we hide secret things. And there is the gem, the jewel, the crystal ball, whatever you want to call it, the orb that we ponder, is hidden there, but we can take it out.
Cool. You might have to move your mic back down slightly because it's.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's yeah. So, yeah, I'm quite interested in that sort of flow state thing that you're saying, because again, there's no logic to that, is there, when you're doing that? You just get an idea and it pursues itself, really.
And I think that they can measure your brain waves and stuff, but they can't explain them.
No.
Like they can say, oh, well, this person's gone into whatever alpha wave state, but they're like, why? How do you provoke it? They don't know.
Yeah.
You know, they can weigh and measure stuff, but they don't have a clue of the why.
So after you had that type of experience then, and you're obviously aware that there's something going on there, where is it that you start to come back? What are the experiences which start to bring you back to, well, where you are now, I suppose, is the best way to put it. And obviously it's a long journey. It's not a case that it suddenly just happens.
Very, very long journey. And I think that the simple answer to that is that in my early 20s, I had these sort of very difficult kind of initiatory experiences. And they were particularly difficult because I didn't have anyone to help me, and I didn't have anyone to guide me. And it's funny because I look back now and I see that there were people who were kind of put in my path who I could have asked for help. But at the time, I didn't realize that that's what they were there for, or that that's what I could have asked them. You know, and I had these experiences that I can, that were completely inexplicable. For example, I had experiences of knowing things that I shouldn't know. I had experiences of a sort of a very fiery inspiration in which I had inspired speech and writing. I had experiences of meeting and interacting with spirits, had experiences of intense runs of synchronicity, and to the point where it wasn't just, these aren't just synchronicities, but this is actually playing out a kind of a mythic pattern, you know, a sort of a mystery play type passage in my life. And the thing is, and this is what sort of made it really difficult for me, is that at the same time, I also had started to suffer from intense spells of depression, and also then shortly after that, from something which I didn't recognize and nobody recognized at first, but which was mania, and sort of, you know, very, very textbook onset of manic depression. And so then all of those experiences became pathologized, and they all became like, oh, but those are just symptoms of mania. You know, those are symptoms of sleep deprivation. Those are symptoms of, you weren't really seeing things, or at least you were seeing things, but they weren't there. And so then for several years, I fell back on the kind of the rational paradigm and said, well, I was just nuts. I was just crazy. There was nothing to any of it. And I felt a horrible sense of shame, you know, and a sense of having betrayed myself by believing in these superstitious things and indulging in that kind of magical thinking. But looking back now, I think that it was almost like a botched sort of initiation. It was stillborn, because instead of falling into the company of people who could have supported and helped me with what I was going through, I fell into the company of psychiatrists. And they were like, all right, well, take this pill, and this pill. And then when you are pacified, and when you are nullified, and when you are sedated, then we'll see about putting you on lithium, and we'll see what that does to you. And, you know, which, I mean, I know lithium does and still has and still does save lives, because it is one of the most powerful stabilizers that you can get. But the fact is that the effective dose of lithium is very, very close to the toxic dose.
Exactly.
So you're putting
So I was going to
poison.
say it could also kill
Poison.
you.
Yes, exactly.
So I'm hoping to be interviewing. Well, it was supposed to be this week, but it's been delayed. Somebody who's written a book about mental illness, but from a point of view of the wisdom of it, and only points to his experiences with South American shaman. And
well, you must give me that reference after, because I would
yes.
I would be really interested in that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the point is that there is a very, very fine line, and of course it's written in stories, isn't it, about, you know, the Merlin stories of, you know, of him being mad, living as a madman in the woods, and that seems to go with the territory. And of course the thing is, to be able to walk in that, the world of the creative, or whatever you want to call it, the imaginal world, or the world of the spirits and all the rest of it, you can't do logic. It's not, you know, it doesn't work like that. It has its own logic. So we've sort of pathologized most of those experiences. And of course, you having those, you know, and often people would bring those states on by doing exactly the things that you mentioned, like sleep deprivation.
Exactly.
Or behavior.
The thing is, you know, I didn't know that at the time. I didn't know that what I was doing was actually had a long and glorious tradition behind it, basically. You know, that like actually the way I was acting and the things I was doing, for example, they were kind of involuntarily, because yes, like I'm not, you know, not for a second am I saying that I didn't have a mental health problem. I did, and I do. And not for a second am I saying, oh, you know, never take your medication because it'll mess up your magic. Like, not for a second, because I'm very aware that we romanticize also the figure of the crazy artist and the mad magician.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that it's very dangerous in a way, because it can give people the impression that any mental illness is actually you know, to be taken as magic, and that's not the case.
Okay, so let's I think we need to sort of explore this a little bit, because
it's a very rich topic.
It is, but you see, the thing is that there's so many layers to this. First of all, some people are not designed to do anything other than be purely logical and purely practical. And that wouldn't have been, it's not a case of now, that would have been the case forever. Some people just are what we would say are normal, and others aren't. And
I would nuance that. And I'd say that, like, magic and poetry and madness are all also normal. It's just that
Yeah. Yeah.
Some people have more of a tendency towards the material,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
towards the physical.
Yeah.
And some people have more of a tendency towards the spiritual
Yeah.
or the creative. But we all have a little bit of all of them. Like if
Yes,
we
we do.
untether ourselves completely from logic, or if we untether ourselves completely from the
Oh, I'm
practical,
not saying
we're
that.
not going to
But
last very long. No,
no,
I know.
no, but what I'm trying to take away all the caveats for a moment, because the problem is we do this a lot. And I'm not saying that those caveats aren't important. I just want to take them away from it, because
All right.
sometimes it obscures what it is that's an important thing that needs to be said. Now, I've had a lot of experiences of very unusual things happening to me without any anything discernible as an illness. Now, I don't know whether that's a case of, certainly I didn't have any sort of mania, although I was very fast thinking, but it never had that peak and trough aspect for me.
Right.
I was just, but I've experienced stuff, where and because I was brought up in a household that was a little bit more open to things like that, it was like, well, that's strange. And then that would be it. It'd be like, okay, I'm aware that I've experienced something there, or I'd have a very, very strange dream that then played out a few days later. Something would happen. You need to go, okay, I know what's going to happen next. And I actually had dreamt it. It wasn't just a deja vu incident. It was something that I remembered from a dream. So I started to realize that there was lots of very odd things going on. So the point is that I think sensitive souls, like yourself and me, if we're then thrust into a world that doesn't do that, we're not able to express that in such a way. And I've been very lucky that I've been able to do that. I've been able to express myself through music and all the rest of it, and live a life that's slightly different from everybody else's. But if I hadn't had a life like that, then maybe I would have had more of those type of moments where you can go, you're suffering from them, you're mentally unwell at the moment. Because it's not really a case, it's just a case of what is the circumstance of your environment. And if your environment is not the thing that upholds you in that, then you will take on, you will become unwell. And then suddenly all the experience, that you would have had anyway, become amplified in that scenario. And who are the type of people who in this society would suffer from that? They are the sensitive people. That's the point.
Yeah.
And who are the ones who are saying that, who's drawing that line of saying, well, this is normal and this is not normal? Well, they're the people who don't have that situation. They are the ones who
exactly. And I think that it's very one thing that I'm always eternally grateful about is that I have suffered, let's say, a set of experiences that gets categorized as mental illness by the kind of reigning paradigm. Okay. Now, but I have suffered.
Yes.
And so therefore it was an illness because I suffered.
Yes.
And I didn't only suffer, I think, because it didn't fit in with society, but there was that. Like it's not normal. It's not normal to go to bed for 3 weeks.
No.
But if we lived in a society where that was accepted, where oh well, he's off on one of his things, he's gonna go to bed for 3 weeks, but don't worry, he'll get up in a while and he'll be fine. Which is like the Viking Kolbitar, the cinder biters, the boys who would not wash for months on end, and they'd lie so close to the fire they could bite the cinders, so they're called cinder biters. And everyone just left them. They were like, oh, don't worry, one day he's going to get up and he's going to wash his face in that freezing stream, and he's going to get a crew together and go do some raiding on the north of England, burn some monasteries. But like that's so in their society they had a paradigm for depression.
That's
right?
what
and it wasn't that the kids who suffered from that were having a laugh. Like they weren't feeling good. They were feeling like shit, but they were allowed to do it and allowed to, like, you know, go into it, go deep, instead of being told, oh no, we need to medicate you so you can get back to work.
Yes, exactly.
You know?
That's exactly what I'm getting at. You see,
Yeah.
I knew somebody who was an artist who would live a, you know, pretty normal life, and then one day she would sleep for 48 hours. She would just not wake up and sleep
Mm-hmm.
for 2 days, 3 days maybe.
Mm.
And of course you look at that and you go, well, that's not. So there's lots of things like that. And you know, why is that? Well, for a start, we would have slept a lot more than we ever do now. You know, because
Especially in the winter.
Yeah,
in the winter, people would just basically never get up. You know,
exactly.
Just snuggle up by the fire,
So
and eat the food that we'd stored.
So what I'm interested in here is, it's obvious that the life that we have sets us a particular environment, and it's not conducive to what the whole idea of magical thinking and all the rest of it. Right? But of course, if you call it something else, then that's absolutely fine.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you call
it's true.
You know, and
especially being an artist has always been a little bit of a get out of jail free card. They're like, you know, oh, he's just got that creative temperament, you know.
yes.
And the guy is like standing on the roof naked, shouting for the lightning to strike him, you know.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, he's so eccentric, you know. I think that the difference between being mad and being eccentric is privilege. It's like poor people are mad,
Yes.
rich people are eccentric.
Yeah.
Normal people are mad, but artists are eccentric. Like if you've got a kind of a, you know, an artistic license, or if you've got like a shitload of money, you're allowed to do whatever the hell you want.
Yes.
But for me, you know, it was really hard because I was a young adult sort of trying to make my way in the world. And I was being told that I was seriously defective, you know, that I had a very serious mental illness, or a mood disorder. And the thing is, I am so lucky because, you know, my reaction to that was to read loads about it, like to read loads and loads and loads of material on it, to really try and understand it, to try and understand not just the books that have been written from a scientific point of view, but those that were written from a more poetic point of view. And then I plunged into my experience, and, you know, I did at one point get some medication, and then it really had a horrible effect on me. I was really rendered sluggish and you know, doped. And then my parents, who are wonderful, they supported me in sort of just trying to be healthier and get off the medication. And they basically let me alone to sort of sleep for 3 months, you know. Like I just remember sitting on the couch in a darkened room with no one else around, watching TV all evening. And that was my fire pit. I was snuggling up to the cinders, you know. And it's funny because my dad had actually come across that cinder biter thing in a newspaper article. And he said that, you know, he said, like, one of these days, you'll just get up. And he was right, because, you know, after several months of like really, really deep depression, I just kind of got up one day and said, right, I'm going to move to Paris. And I did.
Right.
And, you know, and
Yeah.
then, you know, I had a wonderful family doctor too, who was like, he said, well, look, just because you've had patterns of behavior and symptoms that seem to fit into this mold doesn't mean you are anything, or you have to put a label on yourself. Or
Yes.
And so he basically gave me a reprieve. He said, look, you're not bipolar. you're just a very naughty boy. No, you know, he kind of said, look, you know, you've been through a very intense couple of years, and maybe that's just a thing, just a phase, and it's going to pass. And so the fact that he gave me that door open to not being labeled meant that for several years, I was perfectly stable and normal and fine. And then, you know, under certain sets of stressful circumstances, of course, it did come back. And then I had to deal with the fact that it was basically, okay, look, whatever this is you, and you're going to have to deal with it. But then as I got older, I sort of started to think about those crazy experiences I'd had where I was like, you know, wandering around the streets of Edinburgh at 2 a.m, talking to ghosts, and, you know, where I was like, you know, at that time also somebody who I randomly met took me through a kind of a rebirthing experience, like a sort of a vision, guided meditation of rebirthing, and which was amazing. And I started to think, okay, what if I looked at those things and didn't just dismiss them and fear them and feel shame about them, but what if I looked at them and said, okay, yes, you were crazy, but that doesn't mean they weren't real.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
And because I was crazy, I was acting very erratically, and I was acting in a very unhealthy and reckless way. But I had experiences that I could not explain. And I thought, okay, well, look, start thinking about those things as if they have a value, you know, and don't just shut them away and be scared of them. And so when I was in my early 30s, I started really kind of digging deep into researching the occult topics and magic. And what's weird is that a lot of the stuff that I ended up like reading about, I was like, oh shit, so that was what that was.
Yes.
You know, like for example, this was kind of hilarious, but I was such an autodidact because in Cork there was no sort of, you know, magic bookshop. There's no occult bookshop where you could just go and, like, you know, buy stuff. There was nowhere, there was nothing. And so all I had was a bunch of really cheap reprints of like late 19th, early 20th century anthropological texts about, you know, I had like, you know, Fraser, the Golden Bough, and I had Montague Summers, and, you know, I used to love reading about vampires and werewolves and magic. But it was always from a very kind of like, you know, anthropological and also old anthropological, like it was sort of real early anthropology. And so a lot of it was very wrong-headed. But at the same time, I also loved that period, like the late 19th, early 20th century. I was really into that. So I loved that atmosphere. But I would just kind of start doing stuff. Like, for example, when I was 21, and I had heard of tarot decks, you know, and I'd seen, you know, the James Bond film, I think it's Live and Let Die, where there's like Domino, or what's her name?
Yeah, I think it might be Octopussy.
Maybe it is, but you know the one with the tarot reader anyway.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. It's Jane Seymour,
you know,
isn't it? The actress who's
exactly.
Yeah.
So I'd seen.
I don't know why I remember that, but I do.
I remember it vividly myself.
Yeah, I bet you do.
I had seen like a tarot deck, and I knew the basic concept. I knew that it had 4 suits, and I knew that they were based on, or not based on, but they were related to, you know, the typical clubs, diamonds, spades, and hearts. And I also knew that they were, you know, 4 things that were sort of alchemically related by correspondences to the elements and the directions. And, you know, I knew these things, but I'd never actually seen a deck in my hands. And so I just made one up. I just designed a tarot deck, like just said, right, okay, what do you think are the correspondences? What feels right to you?
Yeah.
And I just did it. And I started, you know, in typical fashion, I still have the table of correspondences with all the suits and all the things and all the names. And I think I only actually drew 4 cards, as in, like, you
made
know,
them up.
designed, right?
Yeah.
Designed 4 cards, and then lost interest or got, you know, pulled onto something else. And I used to write sort of like these kind of mythical poems, and have visions, and, you know, enact sort of mythical paradigms in my everyday life, which became great adventures. But then when I was sort of, you know, late 20s, early 30s, and I was supposed to be studying for a PhD, I decided I would just instead spend that time in libraries reading about magic, when I was supposed to be doing a PhD. But it gave me a lot of free time, you know, and so I would I would read, and I did a lot of reading, like massive amounts of reading, which was also very much aided by the fact that, you know, you no longer had to kind of go and root out some old volume in a dusty shop, but you could get stuff on the internet, you know, and so many things were digitized and so many things were just freely available, and I got really good at finding them. And I started listening to occult podcasts, and I started, you know, and I really did a deep dive and found that a lot of the stuff that I'd experienced had a sort of a rationale to it,
Yeah.
and fitted into certain really classic paradigms, you know, like really it fitted into certain what certain traditions have held is, this is how it happens, this is what you do. And that's why I sort of feel like those were definitely initiatory experiences, but they were flawed or aborted, because what I really needed was a guide or a mentor or a group, because they would have helped me to realize, to integrate the experience, and to realize that you don't have to just be scared of this. This isn't just you being crazy.
No.
You are actually participating in a tradition and a thing that is true. And so it was only later then that I managed to like integrate those experiences, and it's something that I'm still working on, because some of the things that happened to me in my early 20s were so frightening and so bizarre that I was afraid to think of them.
Yes.
And
No, I can get that. Yeah.
and in fact, I think I had built up a whole kind of defense mechanism whereby I put them in a box, possibly in the hollow behind the hearthstone, you know, and bricked it up again, and said, look, you don't want to look at that, you know, don't look at that, because that's this way madness lies. And I think that maybe I needed all that study and research and preparation to be able to finally go back and take out those experiences and look at them and say, and look at them with discernment and say, okay, now that was definitely you being a nutter, whereas that, well, there's something to that, you know.
Do you think that a lot of the sort of, let's put it as advice that went round in the folk traditions about dealing with the fairy, or, you know, or the she, or whatever, was similar in that way, that is just like really frightening, and you don't really want to even go there, type of advice, because there is something in that, isn't there? Because I always think that these experiences that, you know, you were saying as a form of initiation, any initiation is dangerous, actually, in its original form. It's not something that, well, you know, I live in Sussex, and there are lots of, you know, weekend retreats to become a shaman type of stuff, you know, which I know some people who've done the proper work, where they've gone off and spent over a period of many years seeing people in, you know, South America, whatever. Okay, we've lost that link. Stuff.
We have. You're right.
But the thing is that those events are not easy, and they're dangerous.
They're not comfortable, and they're terrifying.
Yes, and you couldn't do them here because you'd be done for health and safety. But you could do them in Mexico.
Yeah. I see what you mean. But actually, I think that this is actually, I don't agree with you, because I think that we can do them here. And I think that...
but they're not being done here. That's what, well, I'm saying...
No, they're not.
They are, but not the ones that you could easily find, put it that way.
No, but I mean, the thing is, I think that we tend to exoticize the whole thing and
yes.
say, oh,
yes, oh my God, yes,
you know, I've got to go to Tibet and become a lama. I've got to go to Mexico and, you know, learn that sort of spiritismo, and I've got to go to the Amazon and take ayahuasca. And it's actually, well, you know what? all of that stuff is available on our doorstep. It's just that we have totally lost the structures and the traditions.
That's
you know,
I'm saying.
you don't need to go to the fucking Amazon and take ayahuasca. Like I often think of the wonderful Terry Pratchett, who I gotta say Terry Pratchett is the best writer and the most sensible writer on magic and the magical experience of any, and I'm saying bar none. Like, there are no occult writers who do it better than him. And because he couches it as popular humor, he manages to slip one in. Well, he's managed to slip everything in. In fact, if you read Terry Pratchett's Witches series, the Discworld novels, that is a better magical primer than any other that I'm aware of. And because it has humor and because it has a healthy dose of skepticism in it as part of the mix. But oh shit, what it says is, and I think this is so hilarious, is that he has his wizards, right? The unseen universe.
Yes, yeah.
And they want to perform the rite of Ashkente, which is going to summon death. So they're all these old wizards are like loaded down with medallions and talismans and amulets, and they've got like the ritual dagger, and one of them has to sit on the throne, and they've got all the chalk circles and stuff like that. Whereas the younger wizards, who are basically chaos magicians, they're like in the high energy magic building doing magical research, and they've discovered that you can actually do the rite of Ashkente with 2 centiliters of mouse blood and a matchstick. That you don't need all the trappings.
No.
But the fact is, the trappings help because they help us get into the mind space for it, and there are very few people, I think, who can do magic without some kind of physical, very few people who can just sit in their chair and perform some vast ritual without moving. Like, there's got to be some physicalization, some
because I think it's that idea of, like, with witchcraft, that it's actually embodied. It's actually to do
exactly, and that you have to move, and there has to be, and that's what ritual and ceremony is. It's like codified movements and intentional movements that are symbolic and that are powerful. And then having stuff. I mean, like, I love stuff. I love magical objects, like ritual tools and little magical items and amulets, and and I make them all the time, and I find things that I then sort of consecrate and turn into symbolic objects in my practice, and I love doing that. And it's it really because it helps me to to be embodied in it, that it's not just a purely mental or purely spiritual practice, unless you're some like unearthly yogi who can just sort of sit there levitating and be sending vast tentacles of power across the globe. Most of us need more props.
Yes, we do,
and also, but that's part of the pleasure. I think that sometimes the traditionalists, shall we say, or the more intellectual magicians, they tend to kind of fetishize the gear and the grimoire and the text and the authenticity, and they forget that there is such a huge element of play and joy.
Well, that brings me back to that point you made earlier at the beginning about the fact that this stuff is not logical, and there's always a tendency for us to always come back to the logic of why.
Yeah, we want to codify it. We want to codify it and have a taxonomy, and we want to have a set of exact instructions.
Which is why I was trying to get away from the sort of saying something and then, but just going for the thing and telling the story. Yeah,
constant caveats.
Yeah,
constant caveats.
That's why I was saying. Yeah, but it's not. It's everybody doing it. I do it myself. But what I'm
And
saying is that sometimes it's like, if you think about the dream logic of how the unconscious works, there is no caveat.
no,
I'm sitting in
there
a
isn't.
room, and there is a hamster that lives in the piano, who can play piano. You don't go, why, or that.
Yes, yes, of course. I mean, for a certain value of hamster and a certain value of
It's
play,
exactly, yeah.
no, but it's like what we were going back to is the element of play and the element of joy, which is childlike.
Yeah.
It's not childish, which is the pejorative sense,
Yes, yeah.
but childlike, like a sense of childlike wonder, a sense of enchantment. For me, and this is a thing that I think I first came across in my good friend Lee Morgan's writing. In order to enchant, you must have the ability to be enchanted. And I love that. It's like, yes, you cannot do magic if magic has no effect on you.
No.
And so if you cannot find that state of childlike wonder and enchantment, then I think that your magic is going to be very bloody pedestrian. And if all you're doing is following recipes that were written down 300 years ago and trying to do them exactly to the letter, it's like, well, where's the creativity? Like, where's the flair? There's no flair, that's nerd stuff. And I mean, I get why it's cool. Like, I'm a nerd too about lots of things. I love doing research, and I love finding out how people used to do magic in the Greek magical papyri or whatever. I love that. It's so interesting, but it doesn't mean we have to try to reproduce it exactly.
Yeah.
Because the world has changed, and so have we. And we just need to, I mean, do all the research you want. If you're into research, absolutely give yourself a foundation of knowledge and depth of reference. Absolutely do that. But then you have to make your own. Nobody else can do it for you. Like, nobody can tell you how to do it. They can tell you how they did it, and they can tell you how their tradition did it. But if you don't have a piece to bring to that, if you don't have your own spark to bring to it, I want to say that you're never going to really get much in the way of results, because you'll constantly be testing them, again, in a kind of an empirical way, against someone else's results and against someone else's successes or process or practice. If you're constantly doing that, you're just trying to be empirical again.
Yes, exactly. And again, if we go back to this idea about what the unconscious, that sort of mythic side of that has to be the thing that fires any form of creativity, right?
Yeah.
It's like this idea, drawing it back again to like the creative process about songwriting. If you follow a formula to write a pop song, it's not going to work.
No.
It's got to have that fire in it that makes it work. And I would say that's true with, as you're saying, with magical thinking.
Yeah. But it's not just, I think that we sometimes use the phrase magical thinking in a pejorative way, which means, yes, when you think that things should work in the way magic works, but you're wrong. But this isn't just magical thinking. This is doing magic.
Yes,
this is practicing magic, And I would go further. It's not just practicing it, it's living it.
Yes.
It's living as a magical act and being aware of the magical impacts of all of your daily rituals and all of your daily acts. And if you can get to a place, and none of us can always, but if you're lucky, you can get to it quite often. If you can get to a place where you're aware of the magical ripples that all of your acts and words are having all the time, there's a sort of there's a euphoria in that. But if you manage to center it and to kind of ground that energy, there's a very, very strong position too, because you are able to like manipulate these forces on a day-to-day basis in your daily life. And I can't say I can't prove to you empirically that this makes my life better, but I can prove to you experientially that it does, because it means that my experience of life is as a thing of wonder and enchantment.
Yes.
And even if that's all, even if it's just the psychological difference in my viewpoint, it's bloody worth it, even if that's all it is, you know?
Yes, but does it need to be any more than that? I mean, because again, as
it doesn't. No, it doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to be. And the fact is that to the extent that my mindset and my own projection of reality is what creates my reality, which is basically fundamental, then yeah, why not? Why not just choose to be this, to believe this, to be wholehearted about it?
Yes. When you said about you can't do magic unless magic can enchant you anyway. If you're the sort of person that can't be enchanted, that is absolutely true with hypnotism.
True. Yeah.
So the best hypnotists are the people who easily can be hypnotized. Okay, in their very nature. And I would say that's exactly the same to do with music. If you're enchanted by music, then you can play it. You can create it. But I mean, that seems to be like pretty obvious, isn't it? If you're not enchanted by music, you're not going to be able to do it. I think that's the thing.
And no matter how technically good you get at it, it won't have soul. It won't have soul. It won't have, Exactly. But I think that, we've all seen people in all walks of life, like in all practices, someone who's excellent at something by the book, but just doesn't have that flair, doesn't have the spark. What they used to call the X factor before that program came along and ruined it. But the actual spark, if the person doesn't have the spark, no amount of practice and learning and special gear, like those guys who've got like all the most amazing drum kit, but they've got no rhythm. Like, I mean, they're going to be shit, no matter how expensive their gear is. And the same goes for anything.
There's a phrase amongst the sort of guitarists of a particular time, which is got all the gear but no idea. Which I think sort of more or less.
Yeah. Well, it's exactly it. It's like you cannot buy it. You cannot buy it by having expensive stuff and expensive books. You cannot learn it in the sense of like paying for expensive courses with expensive teachers, and you can't. You can't. You can't practice your way. Like, what's the Malcolm Gladwell thing? Like 10,000 hours you have to spend to become expert at something. It's like, yeah, but you can spend 10,000 hours practicing something, and sure, you'll be good at it. But if you don't have some kind of natural spark at it, it'll still seem a bit soulless, like the world is full of people who do things brilliantly, but we've never heard of them because they, and then it's also full of people who are a bit shit at things, like say singing, but they're Leonard Cohen and they are one of the eternal poets, right? Yeah. He's a rubbish singer. He's a rubbish guitar player. And yet his songs are like sacredly good,
Same with Bob Dylan.
Absolutely, he's a rubbish singer as well. But they have that thing.
It's got nothing to do with what we intellectualize as about what makes the thing. Again, it comes back to that thing about the magical ingredient, which is the thing that.
And I do think that it's. I mean, I'm not trying to say that you're either born with it or tough shit, but I think you can learn to see that way again. You can learn, but it's not about taking expensive courses and it's not about buying expensive books. It's about experience. It's an experiential thing. It's like, no, go into the forest and sit really still for a couple of hours and see what happens. Or go and lie in a darkened room covered in multiple blankets with no sound and lie there for hours and, sensory deprivation, see what happens. Go and take a bunch of drugs and see what happens. No, I didn't say that. I don't advocate that. But that's a short circuit. That's a short circuit way of doing it. I think that anybody who's taken psychedelics has pretty much had a magical experience.
Yes, yeah.
But the fact is that it's because it's kind of unpredictable and a short circuit in our culture, because in some cultures they're very good at sacred ritual use of psychedelics. The ayahuasca is a perfect example, but it can also be done without an artificial stimulant, because we have the resources.
I'll tell you a little story before we finish about
Yeah.
the fact that this stuff is actually going on in plain sight, but not in the way that you'd anticipate it. I'm going back to medication here, but this is to do with heart medication, right? After I had a heart attack, I've actually recorded a program about this before, but I was in a room with a lot of people who, were all on medication, obviously. I don't know, there must have been about 30 or 40 people there. But it was the reaction to what happened that a lot of them were they were definitely on some sort of medication. People who were a lot worse off than I was at that point in time. And I wasn't feeling that good in myself, to be quite frank. But I was sitting in this room, and me being a sort of nosy sod like I am, I was sort of just watching people, because that's the sort of guy I am. I just like to sort of observe. And he was listening to sort of conversation, and it was all a bit sort of like nondescript, as you hear when you're in just like sitting on a bus or something. And then somebody came and started talking about the different types of medication that people were on and all this. But as a general sort of thing about, but by the end of this thing, it almost became like some sort of American evangelical meeting. It was amazing. I was expecting people to get up and start waving their arms about and saying,
what happened?
Well, when people started talking about their medication, they became animated. And I was looking at this and thinking, this is the closest thing I've seen to possession from
Really?
people. Yeah, it was
really
very, very weird. And
are we talking about like beta blockers and stuff and like heart medications? Yeah.
What do you call it? My mind's eradicated the name of the medication.
You've put it in the dark place.
I've hidden it. But yeah, all these type of things of, if you're on this, it's going to prolong your life by X. And and I was thinking, how do they know that? How do they know if you took this for 10 years, it's going to give you an extra year of life? That's like, you can't, there's no logic to that. You can't.
No.
Right. It's sort of completely out of context. And people were just getting so like animated and like excited about this. I thought, I can't, this is doing my head. But, as I say, it's just an experience when I looked at that. And you think, well, these sort of things are going on. There are lots of people on lots of medication.
Yep.
Lots of people don't know, if you chose that, then that's a thing. But I don't know how many people look at that and think, look, okay, I'm taking this for this particular thing. However, what does my relationship with that mean from a spiritual point of view? I know that for a lot of people, it's just like, what? But it's like, well, come on, if you're eating something or ingesting something, it does change you. And maybe you need to think about that in the way that you express some sort of link. I'm not putting this very well, but as an expression of a journey together, you and that tablet, instead of.
I think that's a really good thing to say, and I think that I saw someone once in an internet forum saying that there's a lot of people who are in the kind of the sort of more hippie end of neo-paganism, who shame people for taking psychological meds, and who shame people. They're like, oh, that's so low energy, blah blah blah.
No, no, no,
New
no,
age
no.
people like
No,
no,
what
but
I'm
what I
saying.
no, but I know that's what you, I know that
No,
what you meant.
what I'm
But
actually saying is, could they not be used as part of your journey?
No, but that's exactly what I was coming around to.
Yeah,
And this
yeah,
guy
yeah.
said, au contraire, he said, look, these are part of our pharmacopoeia. These are part of our set of mind-altering substances,
Exactly.
body-altering substances. So you know what? This is not fake. This is not artificial. It's just as artificial as any other chemical. Chemicals aren't artificial or not. They're just chemicals. Everything is chemicals, And so he was saying, look, if this thing helps you, bloody take it. And might we not? And this is your thing,
Yes.
Let us commune with the spirit of Prozac.
Exactly.
Let us.
Type. Yes, that's what I'm saying. Because
and
again,
it's.
Yeah, I think that's the point about, if you think about an animate universe,
Yeah.
then instead of just taking that thing, you need to commune with that thing, if that's what you're doing.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that, people have written quite a lot about art and antidepressants, or art and psychological medications. I don't think I've ever seen anyone write about spirituality and psych meds.
I'll give you this link to this book, because I think you've
okay, brilliant. But the idea that, like, that this is actually a spirit that we spend a lot of time with, like, it's, we are ritually taking this communion every morning,
Exactly.
This is my body, this is my blood, like it's a communion with that egregore, of Prozac, or of lithium, or of Xanax, and so we're altering our body chemistry, but we're also doing something to the way our minds work, doing something to the way our souls feel, and it's not necessarily bad either, but it's certainly not necessarily good. We have to be very conscious. I think you're right. Totally.
Cool.
Yeah.
Right. I think we'll have to stop there.
Oh,
so I got a feeling that this might be
I think I'm just going to be. I'm just going to be like a sort of a regular guest. Like,
yes, I think Mark. That's good enough for me, mate.
Absolutely.
That's really.
I feel like there's still so much more to say, which is great.
I do
it's
think
wonderful.
That too. I do think that too. Well, that was brilliant, because you've covered a lot of things I think would really interest people's way of,
Well, if can I drop a little plug?
Do.
Yeah, because the question of mental health and magic, I've written a long essay about that is on my blog, and it's on the blog, which is thehollowbehindthehearthstone.com, and the essay is called "Physician, Heal Thyself."
Right.
And it's, I picked up a few things from it as we were talking, but it's really a deep exploration of that question. And then also, funnily enough, another tangent, but I started a YouTube channel not long ago, just about a month ago, and there's like, about 15 videos already on there. And I just did one this morning, which was about unverified personal gnosis, and how I think that's a load of bullshit, because all gnosis is personal. How are you going to verify it? By science, anyway. So that really it's a really good, like, the thing I did this morning is a little 10-minute video, which is a really good sidebar to what we were talking about. And so my YouTube channel is called Malachus Ivernus, that magical name that from Anon.
And from a previous episode.
Absolutely, yeah. So that is my YouTube channel, which they're just like little mini essays, and they're called the Dream Pipes of Malachus Ivernus, and then there's little ones in between that are just kind of funny. Anyway, so there's something to check out. That video should be posted by tomorrow.
Cool. Okay.
All right.
I'm not sure
Excellent.
when this is out, but I'll let you know.
It will have already been posted by tomorrow by the time you hear this.
Cool.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Vic.
Right. Yeah, thanks again. And of course, obviously, there's that excellent interview that you had on Spirit Box as well, which people.
Oh yes, with Dara Mason. I was on Spirit Box, and that was a really cool one. Which again is very complementary to what we've talked about today.
Totally. Yeah. All right then, mate. Look after yourself.
Wonderful.
See you.
You too. Bye-bye.
So big thanks to Mark. Obviously, you can reach him through the show notes. Check out the interview that he did with Dara on the Spirit Box podcast, which is really good. Yeah, so until then, I'll see you next time. Cheers. Bye.